Good morning and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining in today. My name is Shabana Ansari. I'm from Maitri, and I welcome you today to Maitri's panel discussion on domestic violence homicides in our communities. With this, we observe the National Crime Victims' Rights Week being commemorated throughout the United States. Since 1981, National Crime Victims' Rights Week has challenged the nation to confront and remove barriers to achieving justice for all victims of crime. During National Crime Victims' Rights Week, we recognize the accomplishments of the victims' rights movement and reflect on how far we have come. Every year, Office of Victims of Crimes leads communities throughout the country in their annual observances of National Crime Victims' Rights Week. In 2025, we are observing National Crime Victims' Rights Week from April 6 to 12th with the theme, Connecting Kinship Healing. This year's themes of kinship is a call to action to recognize that shared humanity should be at the center of supporting all survivors and victims of crime. Kinship is a state of being with survivors that drives vital connection to services, rights, and healing. Kinship is where victim advocacy begins. We have chosen a topic for the discussion today to highlight available services for survivors in our communities and identify the next steps in creating stronger safety net for individuals. Before moving on, a few reminders. This event is being live streamed and also being recorded. Please type in your questions in chat. We'll address them if time permits or respond in a follow-up email. Please feel free to step away if the discussion becomes difficult. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Jaya Suresh, Maitri's Client Advocacy Senior Manager, for moving forward with our discussion. Over to you, Jaya.
Thank you, Shabana, and welcome to our esteemed guests, Dr. Denise Berthe and Amrita Doshi, and to all of you taken time out from your workday to attend this very important discussion that we are bringing across to you. Before I move on to introducing our two esteemed panelists, I just wanted to give a little brief about Maitri. Maitri is a South Asian domestic violence agency based in the San Francisco Bay Area, serving the immigrant population from South Asian countries within Bay Area, within the nation, and also from our home countries. Maitri provides wraparound services, beginning with our helpline, legal, housing, economic empowerment, peer counseling, mental health services to all those who are affected by domestic violence and then reach out to us for help. And we recently celebrated our 35th birthday on February 23rd this year. We are 35 years old, so that's how long we have been working in this space here. Now, moving on to the discussion today, just as I'm sure everybody who is joining today are aware that domestic violence is a scourge that is present across all society, across all communities, here, outside of Bay Area, in the nation, outside, everywhere in the world. It's a scourge that needs to be removed. And what is domestic violence? It is a pattern of abuse by one partner over another partner. And what is and the usual reason is because they want to exert control over the other person. And what makes domestic violence very lethal and very takes it to dangerous level is the possession of firearms. Because when a firearm is introduced into a situation like that, it leads to homicide or murder. And statistics shows that more than half of all intimate partner homicides involve a firearm. The presence of a gun in a domestic violence situation can increase the risk of homicide for women by as much as 500%. And the national statistics, that 76% of intimate partner firearm homicide victims are women. And coming down to our state, California has higher rates of domestic violence experienced by both men and women when compared to the national average. There were 103 domestic violence related homicides in California in 2023, of which 74 of the fatalities were female and the rest were male. And this shows the proportion, right? The disproportionate effect on women because of firearms. And also, domestic violence has a significant economic impact in California. In 2022, the total cost of domestic violence to the state of California was $73.7 billion. So all of this show that we as a community need to come together to understand, right? To understand what is domestic violence first and how firearms can exacerbate the situation that is already there and what we as a community can do about it. And it is my great pleasure to introduce two esteemed guests today, both of whom and their organizations have worked very much on this firearm violence in domestic violence. I would like to welcome Amrita Doshi. She's the co-founder and executive director of South Asian SOAR. SOAR was founded in 2021 to bring together all the South Asian agencies working on gender-based violence, advocates, survivors, and supporters under one roof nationally. Like many, her entry into this work begins with survivorship. She first found this path as an intern at Saki for South Asian survivors, later working across public health, healthcare technology, and community-centered design in the US and in India. Welcome, Amrita. Dr. Denise Berthe is the Executive Director of Peaceful Families Project, which is a 21-year-old national project addressing family-based violence in Muslim communities in the United States. Dr. Berthe has been a licensed clinical psychologist in Pennsylvania, Delaware, and the state of Palestine for over 30 years with a specialty in trauma, torture, oppression, war, interpersonal violence, and indigenous populations. Welcome, Dr. Denise. So, Amrita, I'll hand the mic to you first so that you can talk about SOAR and the project that SOAR has been working on for the last couple of years.
Thank you so much, Jaya, and to the entire Maitri team for having me and SOAR at this really important conversation today. As Jaya said, for the past 3 years, South Asian SOAR has been working on a campaign called Their Light Remains. And it's a campaign that was created for this very purpose of honoring the lives that were lost to domestic and gender-based violence each year in the South Asian community in the US. So I'm going to share my screen to share both a little bit more about SOAR and then a little bit more about our campaign and what we're actually seeing right now. And I hope that for those who are following the issue, or maybe you're even more steeped in it, that this can illuminate kind of what are the most recent patterns and trends that we're seeing. And as Jaya said, what can we as a community do and what calls to action can we also put out to, policymakers, funders, anyone else that can support and be responsible for helping to prevent this type of violence. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and Jaya, will you just give me a thumbs up and let me know that it's working? Okay, wonderful. So we are South Asian SOAR. SOAR actually stands for Survivors, Organizations, and Allies Rising. And I really appreciate saying our name because our name is a symbol of what and who is required to end violence. We have to center survivors' voices. Organizations like Maitri and their sister organizations all across the US, including Peaceful Families Project, are critical in providing services, in providing support to the community, as well as education and community outreach towards ending violence. And then allies, all of you. That could mean, you're someone who wants to support survivors. Maybe you support an organization, maybe you witness violence, and maybe you're still starting your journey and understanding what does this issue even look like. your voice is important at the table. And together, when we come together, that's the way that we can end and prevent violence. The reason that we need this huge national movement is we need a movement that matches the scale of the issue. So the latest research tells us that 48% of South Asians, both men and women, experience at least one form of gender-based violence. We kind of use the term gender-based violence to be a bit more inclusive of different types of violence. So this could include child abuse, it could include domestic violence, it could include financial and emotional abuse, which again, these are all sort of intersecting terms. So I know it's a mouthful, but we're really trying to just use it as a more generalized term for all of these different ways that violence can exist. And we actually have a very long history, including Maitri's own, where since the 1980s, over 45 organizations across the US have actually emerged to support South Asian survivors. Typically, what those organizations are doing are providing direct services support, education to the community, etc. And these are really vital life-saving resources. And so SOAR actually was created, as Jaya said, to bring those organizations together, and you can kind of see a map of them here. So our mission is, as I mentioned, to grow and kind of bring together and unite this national movement so that we can change both the culture and systems that actually lead to this violence, so that we're not only responding to it, but we're actually able to both work together and address it in a preventative way. On the right, you can just see some of the samples of our work. To get a little bit more specific, here are a few things we do, or kind of the key areas of work. So we do a lot of capacity building for community-based organizations. Right now, we have 47 of them in our network. We build survivor and community power. This looks like community organizing, the work with allies, building the voices of survivors. And then we kind of publish all of that in collective advocacy reports, campaigns, statements, books, and more. One of those being Their Light Remains, which is what I'll be sharing today. To date, we have 47 organizations and a little over 200 survivors and allies all across the US in our network. So we are a strong and growing movement, and I know that together is how we'll actually tackle the issues that we're talking about today. So thank you to everyone that is on this call. You're certainly part of the movement. So to bring us to the topic today, every year since SOAR has started, we have taken a moment at the end of the year to honor South Asian lives lost to gender-based violence. And I wanted to share, to start, a little bit of the timeline of how we actually got here and what we consider as critical parts of this campaign and advocacy. And I actually really loved what Shabana was saying about kinship. So much of honoring lives lost to violence isn't only statistics and only numbers, but it is about honoring the humanity, both of our community and the victims that we've lost. And so that's actually at the center of this campaign. I wanted to start and take a moment to share the portraits. These are actually the people who we've lost over the past 3 years, 2022, 2023, and 2024. I'll just give you a moment because I feel like looking at their faces always makes this more real and more powerful. And Their Light Remains was actually a collective name that us and our organizations decided together, because for us, it symbolizes that even though these people are gone, both their light and their stories remain, and they are the driving force for the advocacy that we do. And so that is kind of like where I dedicate this work and all of the advocacy that we're doing on this issue. So what are the elements of the campaign? As I mentioned, humanity is at the center. And so you'll see right here, kind of one of the key elements is writing the stories and creating portraits to honor the lives lost. You just saw all of the portraits on the last page, and we work with the South Asian artist Naina Hussain to create all of these portraits. And if possible, we work with the family members of the victim to understand what they would feel most represents the victims whose lives have been lost. On the left-hand side, I'll just start with collective grieving and reflection. I think this is also about honoring our own humanity. So again, how do we relate to these? Grief is so hard to actually make space for when we're so busy in our day-to-day lives. Advocates are constantly responding to mounting and daunting amounts of community need. But what we heard is that the invitation through Their Light Remains is to really ask, how can we mourn and honor these lives moving forward? So we try to pair each story, each portrait of the lives that have been lost with some prompts for reflection. Data-driven insight and analysis. Data and media and research are really at the heart of the campaign. It's how we understand what are the patterns that are happening and what are the calls to action or ways we can advocate to prevent that violence. And throughout the rest of the presentation, I'll be sharing some of those key data points. I talked about stories and portraits, so I'll share a little bit about the community education piece. This is kind of the heart of today's call, right? How can we take everything that we're learning and doing and actually make it accessible and approachable to our community, so that they understand the issue, so that you all know where to tap in? How can I support my neighbor? How can I look out for this? How can I understand what organizations exist across the US so I can connect someone in need? And so this community education piece is so important. And we actually do that in the form of a letter. It's kind of a way that we, like you write a letter to a friend, you write a letter to someone you care about. And that's kind of how we frame the letter. And lastly, calls and pathways for action. This is something that we've been trying to do more strongly over the years as we understand better what are the patterns and pathways for prevention, is sharing calls to action, both for, as I mentioned, policymakers, funders, et cetera, as well as our own community. Just to share a little bit of the timeline, we started the campaign in 2022, and it happened very organically. We were just hearing the news, seeing the media reports of some of the highest profile cases, and we started to look at the numbers. And by the end of the year, I think we had heard of 10, some reported in the media and some not. And we said 10 is a huge number. And that was actually unprecedented for the past years. And so we decided to start kind of the first version of the campaign. The next year, that number and list grew even more. And we honored the loss of 17 lives to gender-based violence. And so these are kind of the portraits from 2023. And that year, we actually published a public tracker of all of these cases as well. And then last year was our third campaign, and we kind of grew it even more. Not so much the people that we honored, but we grew it by drafting this collective letter with organizations like Maitri and our sister organizations across the US. We had 40 plus organizations standing together, demanding change and sharing awareness about these issues. So now I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking about this crisis, and I know Sister Dennis is going to go into it more deeply as well, and so will the Q&A at the end. So I just wanted to highlight a few. First and foremost, I think the tragedy of death is kind of the worst case in these instances of gender-based violence. But I have noticed that as a community, that tends to be maybe the moment when we realize we have to do something, because we're not seeing just, we're not, I think, a life being lost and a life being cut short helps us understand, like, what is the reality of this violence and what is the loss, and not just in one family, but an entire community and generation. I also wanted to name that this is just mostly from media reports, which means there's likely more. And these are a conservative estimate or understanding of what domestic violence and gender-based violence homicides look like. So here's what the data tells us from 2024. I'm just going to highlight a few that I think are pretty critical, and then I'll dive into them just a little bit. 12 of the lives lost, so 60 over half, were under the age of 35. That was actually the highest incidence of what we're calling youth violence that we've seen so far. 8 of the lives lost were immigrant women, and I would say almost all of them were either first or second generation immigrant families. 74% of the lives lost were due to gun violence. That was what Jaya was talking about, the presence of firearms. And then I think another thing that has been particularly interesting and perhaps unique to our community, as well as devastating, is that 74% of the lives lost were due to murder-suicides. This is when the person who caused harm also kills themselves in the act of violence. So just to go through like a little kind of rapid fire of these key statistics, as I mentioned, the high incidence of violence for people under the age of 35. I wanted to point out a lot of our research has shown, and this data, obviously, that young lives are lost even when youth are not direct victims of IPV or domestic violence. So often we're thinking, I think the stereotype almost of domestic violence is it's a man and a woman in a marriage, and they are the only two impacted. What this statistic reads to me and tells us is that entire families are affected. And I am always struck by this third statistics on this slide that in a 2021 study of South Asian adults, just under half of the respondents reported witnessing violence among their parents or parental violence. I don't think we talk enough about the impact on kids who grow up in a home with domestic violence. Obviously, the worst case being they end up being victims of the violence as well. Secondly, gun violence, and I know Sister Dennis is going to talk through this, so I won't talk about it as much, but this is a year-over-year trend that we see. And as I think, Jaya, you mentioned, abusers with guns are 5 times more likely to kill their victims. This is absolutely an area of prevention and advocacy that needs a lot more effort and support, especially when I think there are maybe myths or misunderstandings about what gun ownership and presence looks like in the South Asian American diaspora. And finally, I just wanted to touch on murder-suicides. I think this ends up being one of the hardest things to talk about, but is really critical. I think it points to a bunch of things around mental health, access to health, the stigma around mental health, and again, what does it look like when entire families are lost? Because what we typically see in murder-suicides is it also involves the children. So I think there is a lot more research and understanding that's needed here in terms of the factors and also solutions that could exist when we're talking about murder-suicides. Finally, I just wanted to quickly share what are our calls to action. At a high level, mental health support is a huge one. Youth violence prevention, youth healing, really focusing on youth. Gun violence, as I mentioned. Robust pathways to safety and justice. Often what we're seeing is the folks who are victims of this type of violence are not actually getting to justice. They're not getting to help. So we need to increase outreach and pathways to justice so that they can actually leave these situations. Engaging men, not just as people who cause harm, but also people who are survivors, people who, children as well. And finally, supporting culture and narrative change. I can't tell you how many times I hear of one of these stories where a mother-in-law, a mom, a grandmother has asked someone to stay in that relationship. And what does it mean for us to shift some of our understandings around marriage, around partnership, around divorce, so that it's not shameful to leave one of these situations, even if it means, breaking up a family. And I think that's going to require culture and narrative change. We're going to drop the links, I think, in the chat as well as in the follow-up email, but you can read the entire letter where we share this data on our website. And then I just wanted to quickly close with what do we think is the future of this campaign? Because I think it's relevant to this call. So we do want to analyze data over 3 years. I think this will help us understand historical patterns and longitudinal patterns. Publish local media op-eds to get to more South Asian folks, how do we get the people that won't be hearing about this? How do we get this shared on WhatsApp and where people are at in their communities? And then thirdly, getting community to engage in action. So how can we make this approachable? And I'd love to hear from all of you at some point in how we can actually make this information and the calls to action something that you can tap into. And finally, just wanted to end again with a dedication to these individuals on the slide. That's what, drives our work and this conversation today, and this is who we do it for. Thank you so much again to the Maitri team. I look forward to the Q&A portion.
Thank you so much, Amrita, for your illuminating and discussion on homicides and DV victims, and especially their light remains project, right? Because the title of the project itself is very poignant, because we want their light to remain. We just don't want them to be just forgotten people, right? We just want to honor their lives. So thank you so much for it. And all the statistics and everything that you've shared is very, very informative and educational for all of us. And it's a lot to take in. But so to everybody here, please, you can visit the southasiansoar.org website to get all of the information if you're still needing to grasp all the things that Amrita talked to you about today. And now I would like to hand over the mic to Dr. Denise Berthe to talk about their project.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. Can you all see my screen? Is that? Yes.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Okay. So I am Dr. Denise Berthe. I am so honored at the moment to be serving as the Executive Director of Peaceful Families Project. As you heard, Peaceful Families is a 21. We are fully adult age 21-year-old organization, really that has emerged as the think tank around domestic violence within Muslim communities here in the United States. We engage in 4 major activities, which include training. That includes training of trainers, training of religious leaders, training of systems that touch Muslim lives, and then training within communities through our trainers. So we have over 50 trainers across the country. We have 5 major programs and curriculums. So training is a big piece of what we do. The second piece of what we do is research. So Peaceful Families has done the major surveys around domestic violence in Muslim communities. The first was done in 2011. We re-examined similar data in 2023. We just finished a study on Muslim male attitudes, beliefs, and experiences of family-based violence. And we are currently, if any of you know Muslim youth between the age of 18 and 24, we are currently doing a study of Muslim youth across the country. So we really, as well as the sort of national surveys, we also work on looking at our programs themselves and making sure that they are sort of providing the outlook, the outcomes that we would like. And I am going to talk about one of our studies that is ongoing, which is also a campaign called In Their Names, which is where we get our data around homicides within the Muslim community in the United States. The third thing that we do is resource development. So we have full curriculums, as well as infographics, videos, and other kinds of things to make sure that the information that folks get makes sense to them culturally and in their faith community, right? We know that most of the information sort of was done by forgive me, white, middle-class Christian sort of thought framework. And we want to make sure that there are alternative theories, practices, curriculums, and opportunities for folks who may be looking at things in a different kind of way. The fourth thing that we do is what's called strategic representation, which is to make sure that Muslim voices and Muslim data is at the table when decisions are being made. So because of that, we are part of the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the National Interfaith Coalition Against Domestic Violence, the National Task Force Against Forced Marriage, and work with all of our partners so that we can make sure that the Muslim experience is part of what is being looked at and what is being studied. And we're going to talk very specifically about intimate partner homicides among U.S. Muslims in the United States. So let me sort of jump into that data because I know we don't have a lot of time. I want to, unfortunately, as you saw portraits, we also started it. I was sort of shocked by the same path that we all took. Around 2021, we began collecting data simply for the same reason, as you heard previously, through SOAR. We just began to get so many cases. And we thought that the best way to honor these folks was not only to say their names, to do our work in their names, but to actually collect data so that we could better understand how to prevent and what to do about domestic homicide within our community. And these are some of the beautiful faces that we lost, these beautiful souls that we lost. We have Sister Sadia Mansour. That was one of the first case. And that is where a mother-in-law, a mother, and a daughter lost their lives in the same literal 3-minute period, along with the perpetrator. We had Sister Sania Khan, who was actually blogging about her experience as a South Asian woman, being divorced, and that perpetrator also lost their life. We have Sister Alwiya Muhammad, who lost her life along with the perpetrator, Dana Al-Taibi, and then one of the most horrific case where we had a mother of 9 children who were in the house and witnessed the homicide. So I do want to talk about the idea of research. We, not unlike SOAR, are gathering information without a lot of funding and what is available publicly. So this is a technology-based research. We are following up on news articles on media. Also, we have an ongoing website where families and community members can talk about cases. So we get cases really and truly by accident, and I'll talk about the 42 cases that we now have. But the idea is that no one is collecting data on a regular basis on women, especially looking at faith and ethnicity, deciding and getting information about what is happening in terms of domestic homicide. So this is a nationwide data collection effort. We have a 3-year now campaign where we are collecting data and seeking out data. We do a case selection based on our inclusion criteria. I'll talk about that in a second. And we're looking in terms of analysis at victim and perpetrator demographics, the assessment of homicide, community response, and then whatever other data that we can gain through the methods that we have. So this slide, unfortunately, gets updated on a more regular basis than I would like to see. We have at this point 28 cases with 42 victims that are included in our data. And these are some of the names and the dates. As you see, we are very heavily from 2020 and beyond, but we have been able to collect data from a little bit earlier as well. So you heard about gun violence, and unfortunately in our cases, 61%, which sounds similar to SOAR's, were gun violence was implicated as the major methodology of domestic homicide within our community. And I think, we had not only the 42 victims, but 12 children die at the point of a gun. And the reason we did have 8 cases occur in the state of Texas, which is one of the places that has the most liberal gun laws. We, of course, know, now this is an issue within our community. Unfortunately, we have also had a 400% increase in violence against Muslims in the past 2 years. one of the ways that Muslims, even Muslim women, believe that they are to be safe is to have a firearm. Unfortunately, we know that it is a 90% chance that if you have a firearm in your home, that it will be used against you, as opposed that you will be able to use it for protection. So I think we need to think seriously. We need to talk seriously to our communities who are feeling, especially now, immigrant communities, Muslim communities are feeling as targeted by violence, by gun violence. And there is this belief that if I have a gun, I will be able to protect myself. We know that is not true in general, and that is certainly not true for Muslim women who are victims of domestic violence. So I think it is very important for us to talk to our communities around gun violence, what guns have the capacity to do. I also want, as a psychologist, I'll talk a second about why gun violence is so much more lethal than other kinds of violence. Gun violence takes a second. You don't have time to think about it. You are, likely in a state of what we call parasympathetic fight, flight, freeze, or friend. You're sort of in a frenzy, and in a second, a gun goes off and is lethal. Any other forms of violence, beating someone, using a knife, all of those things take more time and leave space for a second thought, a stopping thought. Gun violence does not allow us to do that. And I can tell you, even both in the cases I've dealt with as a forensic evaluator and in the cases that we've seen, there is even regret. But regret after a gun goes off is too late. The second factor that we saw equal to SOAR is that 9 out of our 26 cases, or 74%, were homicide suicide. So we know that within our both faith and ethnic cultural traditions, that this is more common than not. That the perpetrator, for a wide variety of reasons, whether it is sort of the ultimate act of control, you will not even die without me, or it is fear of what will happen once they are caught, but that homicide suicide is in fact more likely than not. Oh, I'm sorry, I had that backwards. Homicide suicide for us is 25%. Straight homicide is 74%. I do apologize for making that mistake. We also have in our data that close to 60% of the women, and because all of our victims but one were women, more than half were in fact separated or trying to separate. And that goes along with data that we know that, unfortunately, as a victim of domestic violence, you are more likely, it is more dangerous to leave than to stay. And that is unfortunate. I do want to talk about the history of intimate partner violence. We do know that domestic homicide feels like it comes out of nowhere. When we talk to folks, it sounds like these things that these were the nicest couple. We had no idea. What we actually found in our data was that 88% of the cases did have a known history of IPV, and over 62% of the cases were planned. They took multiple steps over time to be able to gather together what was needed, or the secrecy needed to be able to complete the homicide. In our cases, 8 out of the 26 cases resulted in 14 collateral victims, or 14 corollary victims. So that was over a third of the cases. And 36% of the victims were children or family members. We did not have unrelated victims. Were children or family members of the what we imagined was the intended victim. This is also a difficult topic to talk about. Many of the perpetrators and victims of the cases in our study came from what we call high conflict areas. They were either new immigrants or within families that had recently immigrated. And those, you can see the countries. Now, I don't want this to be taken wrongly, which is to say immigrants in general do not have higher levels of domestic homicide or higher levels of crime than other communities. We want to make that very, very clear. I do want to talk, however, about the international reactions and services to new immigrant populations who are coming from high conflict areas. We know that the United Nations right now is very big on what's called mental health first aid. And when we're talking about active situations of genocide, of horrific multi-generational armed conflicts, that folks need more service than a couple of sessions, right? We also know that there's not only taboo around getting mental health services, but knowing that you have mental health issues gets in the way of the immigration process itself and is something that can be used against folks. So we need to not only make services more available, we need to make conversations around PTSD and mental health effects of trauma from coming from high conflict areas, but we also need to really, and this may not be the right time or the place, but really need to work with some of the obstacles to immigration when folks are actively admitting that there are mental health issues. We also looked at media bias. So 19 out of the 26 publicly reported cases demonstrated media bias that propagated, we don't use the word Islamophobic, but Islamically targeted stereotypes, right? And you can read some of them. The idea was that, unfortunately, we became aware of these cases because they could be used in terms of really sort of language that was not representative and was not sort of accurate around the issues of culture and faith. We also looked at religious engagement, right? Because we sometimes have the idea, even within our own community, that if you are religious enough, if you are faithful enough, that those things will save you. And what we found was actually the opposite, that there was no correlation between whether a woman was wearing hijab or not wearing hijab, whether they were attending services regularly or not attending services regularly, whether the perpetrator was involved in religious worship or not. That religious engagement really was a non-factor. That being more traditional, being more religious, being more involved in the community did not protect families from domestic homicide. The second piece that we look at is the community response from religious leaders. Within many of our communities, especially now, especially when issues happen that we want to look at as a community, we want to sort of receive comfort as a community, it is more likely that folks will go to their own religious tradition, their own cultural and ethnically specific religious leaders to get comfort. And what we found was that in only 6 incidents did we have religious community responses, to the point where even at the funerals of some of these victims, the words domestic violence, homicide were not mentioned. And this was one of the things that was really upsetting to the first responders, to the domestic violence advocacy communities, some of whom had been working with these victims, that even at that last moment when we are laying that body to rest, the domestic violence is not being mentioned, is not being spoken about. In even less, in 15%, only in 4 incidents were there long-term DV-related responses from the religious community. And to be honest, at least half of those were a survey. We're going to take a survey and see how this. real response to what had happened to these victims, real understanding and sort of we must do better response was not present in the majority of cases. And that is very disheartening. One of the things that did come up, at least for us, and I did hear the folks from SOAR talk about, was also services to perpetrators. So one of the debriefing sessions that we held, actually in the case of Sister Mansour, where it was her mother, herself, and her daughter who were murdered, were that the men in the community knew. They knew that this man was unraveling. It was a series of events. And what this gentleman came to us and said was, I feel so guilty because we saw it and we did not reach out to him. Now, many people reached out to the victim. She was a teacher in an Islamic school, but men really found it hard. They wanted to separate themselves. They did not want to deal with someone that they could see. And in hindsight, this gentleman came to us and said, if we should have stopped, we should have worked with him. Out of that, we actually at Peaceful Families started an entire project called Peaceful Partners, which is headed by a group of Muslim men for peaceful families. We know that, and we also have what now is called a Muslim men's bystander program, so that the brothers within our communities know what to do when they begin to see this kind of response from each other. So in conclusion, gun violence, we know that guns are the biggest factor in really predicting homicide versus other forms of domestic violence. We do need focus on immigrant populations who have faced degrees of isolation and violence, not because they are more likely, but because they face unique factors. Culturally competent and spiritually integrated services must also be trauma informed. We need to get our religious leaders more aware and talking about these issues. Most of our victims were women. Domestic violence must be, and again, this is hard for us at this moment, must be addressed in the context of power and control, misogyny, and gender-based violence. We do need to destigmatize mental health and realize that there is always a place to intervene. There's always a place to stop. And then the last pieces, of course, is engaging Muslim men and acknowledging Muslim male survivors of domestic violence, but also the power that Muslim men have in counseling, in guiding each other. And I think that is it.
Thank you, Dr. Denise, for your very wonderful talk on this subject. I think this will come across as really eye-opening for a lot of people who are here today to hear about how domestic violence and gun violence play in the Muslim community. So thank you both very much for your wonderful presentations. And now I would like to put you guys again on the spot by asking a few questions. We would, since we are hoping that most of you will be able to stay back. We are thinking of extending this session until at least 12:15 so that we get a chance to ask a few questions and get our panelists' responses to those questions. Okay. Thank you all so much for staying on and listening to this wonderful and very important topic. So the first question I would like to address to both of you, and either one of you can pick it up and then go with it, is why do you think that we need culturally responsive services for DV victims and survivors?
I'll say something and then I will pass it over. So what we found from our data is that while domestic violence numbers are not different, the trajectory, what are critical factors, what are protective factors, what are culturally specific stigmas, where people go for help really depends on that intersectionality, their faith community, their their culture, which generation they are, their level of education. We do know that if we are waiting for folks to work into mainstream services, that just really isn't going to happen. That people will go to people that they believe have the same beliefs as them, the same understanding of marriage, all of those kinds of things. And that is why we need these very specialized services. The other thing that I didn't mention, and I did want to talk about when we talk about data sharing, we have knowledge. I will tell you the saddest story about in their names data was not having anything to do with the women themselves, but when we sent this data to be published in an academic journal. And it came back, it was not published, which happens, we're researchers, this happens, but the review was unbelievably offensive. What they said is, you guys are just hiding. What your real problem is honor killings, and you need to be talking about that. And because you're not talking about that, we're not going to even publish this data, this very important data that would inform mainstream providers about what goes on in our community. And that became a whole thing. And that data is being looked at by going to be published in a different place. But I think it also talks about the fact that mainstream providers many times don't know what to do with culturally specific faith, survivors of faith. That when our folks go into mainstream services, and I can tell you from my own experiences, we are told, you know what, your problem is you're Muslim. Just stop being Muslim, and then you won't have a difficulty. So we need to make sure that the service provider, not only our victims know where to go, but service providers know how to provide services to folks that have specific religious, cultural, or ethnic practices or beliefs.
Thank you, Dr. Dennis. Amrita?
I think you covered it all. I just have a few things to add because I mean your presentation was incredibly enlightening even for me. But I just like to make it very simple, I think one of the barriers that comes up the most is language, for example, right? Like having people that can speak and support you in language is so critical, especially with the level of immigrant clients that we're talking, and immigrant survivors and families that we're talking about. Another thing that stood out to me from your answer that I think happens to survivors is the level of judgment, right? Like, how can you go to seek out support when someone is saying, well, this happens this way in your community, and they're not able to understand or meet you where you're at? And I think like that happens even within the South Asian community. There's so much diversity probably in like the Muslim community at large, right? Like religion, ethnicity, language, customs. And so there's already so much diversity that we're working with to build cultural context around. And I think honoring that diversity is really important to getting even South Asian organizations to meet South Asian clients and survivors where they're at. The third thing that I was thinking about was even when you were sharing about, Sadia Mansour's family, like in order for us to have the community processing spaces where someone is vulnerable enough to say, like, I should have done something, means we have to have those relationships. We have to be able to trust one another. We're probably going to the same temple or mosque or dance community or whatever it might be. And I don't think there's any way that those mainstream organizations, and many of them come to our orgs asking, like, how do I build that? How do I get in this space? And this is where we live, and that's also where we support one another. And so I think having those community-based relationships are critical, and that's where I think culturally specific organizations are especially needed. And lastly, I just wanted to add, I think when we zoom out, I feel like we hear of, I don't know the statistics off the top of my head, but I would say the majority of survivors don't feel comfortable with the current solutions as they exist, right? And I think that's because culturally specific services haven't been as funded and supported as they've needed to be to allow things like the Peaceful Partners Project to exist, right? Like things that will actually be built by us and for us. So those are some of the different things that I think about on levels from services to even the advocacy and prevention piece, where culturally specific organizations are critical.
And the other
Yeah.
thing is that we haven't talked about that we know is an issue is right now that folks are too afraid, right? So going for services, we no longer have safe spaces. Forget our, religious communities, but even courthouses are now not safe, right? So if you are someone who's going in for service, you're already nervous. And then there's a little bit more faith that your own community is not going to be engaged with, with ICE, with immigration reporting and other kinds of things. So I think right now we're playing an even more critical role because folks are terrified to go to anyone else.
Can I add just one thing to that? Like, similarly, I think that's what I feel, and I think we all felt like happened during COVID, right? Like, I often describe these organizations not only as DV and GBV orgs, but they are community support systems. Like, they're filling every gap that needs to be filled. And so I think anytime there's a crisis or a need, like, they're stepping up. And I think it's now, and I think during the pandemic, and probably any other time, before that as well.
Yeah, what both of you say is so true, right? In our work and my 35 years of work, this is what we have realized, right? How important culturally appropriate services are, right? And especially, Amrita, what you said about language, it is just such a crucial piece of the work that we do. Because when a survivor calls on the helpline and is able to talk to a person in the language that she can and she's comfortable with, the whole thing changes, right? Immediately trust starts building and you're able to start work from there, right? So language is such a important and crucial piece of the work that all of us do in our own agencies. And what you said, Dr. Denise, about the climate now and how important it is for us to show up on behalf of our population that we serve, right? Because they are already scared. So we need to be there to be able to provide them that little bit of comfort and help as they go through this process. Now, moving on to the another question is, both of you have been there's so much of work that both your organizations have been doing. How do you think that we can engage more with communities to bring about changes in attitude towards about DB, right? We know both of you did talk a little bit about it, but what is it that we can do, right? Because that seems to be the biggest struggle, to get the entire community to understand that this is something that needs to end. So what are all the different ways you may have approached it, and any thoughts on how we can do in the future?
My answer is like anything and everything. Like, I think one is building the people power around it. And I think in order to do that, I feel like education and art and stories are really critical. Like, I noticed that that's what people latch onto the most. And I think one thing I would say, even in the education piece, is prioritizing the accessibility of it, making it feel like a conversation, making people feel invited into it, right? Like, I think even just within our movement, like, become a bit more academic or a bit more, like whatever it might be. And so really applying that culturally specific lens, applying a very community-centered lens to how we do education. I love that you have so many curriculums, and there's so much that's been created. And so I think finding the people then, like the young people, the elder people, the parents who can apply that education and be ambassadors for those messages. I think investing in building that, I would say, like, honestly, like allyship and ambassadorship for the movement, so people understand some of the basics of how do I support a survivor, but also how do I, and I love the name Peaceful Families, right? Like, what is the goal that we're trying to reach towards? It's not just ending violence, it's actually building like healthy communication, autonomy, respect. And so those are things everyone can practice. So I think one, I would say, mindset shift is like, it's not just like, how do we learn about violence and the difficult statistics and how to get someone to help, but also on the prevention side, how do we learn the basics of being like good humans to each other, supporting one another, intervening, but also practicing this again, like as a child, as a parent, as an elder person in the workplace, whatever. So I think, yeah, making people agents of change through education, and I think touching people's hearts and minds through stories, and finding more ways to honestly put responsibility on community. Like, it's not only on organizations to solve, support, do all the education, right? Like, we have all got to do it together. So those are some of the things that I think about.
Well, and thank you so much, because you gave me a great leeway. So that's exactly what we've done at Peaceful Families. So the idea of course is domestic violence doesn't start when you're 25 and you get married, and that there are touch points throughout the lives of our community that really need to be worked with. So our 5 curriculums, not going to go through all of them, but I'll talk about the different touch points, because what we're looking at is domestic violence is not an act in time, that it is a set of beliefs, attitudes, and skills that go throughout the lifetime. So we actually, our first program start is called Peaceful Parents, and we promote and are working on, it's our baby curriculum that's not quite done yet, working on how to promote non-oppressive, non-violent child rearing from the very beginning, right? So that we teach as parents, because a child who has never been physically beaten it's going to be bizarre to them to pick up their hand to beat another person, whether that be a male or a female. So we have Peaceful Parents. The second thing that we have is called Peaceful Futures, which is our programming for middle school, high school, and university age folks. We talk about identity. What do Muslims do? What do their relationships look like? We talk about communication. We talk about mental health. We talk about cyber citizenship. We talk about all of the things that give you the building blocks to then build a better family. We work with the Muslim Student Association. So we work with the university age folks to talk about Islam was created to protect vulnerable people. And there are things, the reason that we have a contract to get married is that it's a contract, and it was supposed to be for human rights, and you're allowed to put things in there, and you're allowed to demand things, and you're allowed to negotiate things, so that we work with folks even before marriage. And around what we don't call dating violence, but something called courtship coercion, right? What's going on with forced marriage? What's going on when I started chatting with this gentleman and I wasn't supposed to, and now he's threatening to out me to my community, to my family, those kinds of things. So the third program that we have is, of course, the Peaceful Partners, which is engaging boys and men. And we do have a program specifically in North Carolina right now, which is OVW funded, called The Future is Fatua. How do we teach leadership in men? We're not going to fight with, okay, be leaders within our families, but what does good leadership look like? What do good leaders look like? We have our newest curriculum that is out, is called Peaceful Partings, which looks at grief, separation, divorce, and co-parenting, because a lot of within the Islamic perspective, at least, divorce is something that's allowed. It's religiously given to us, but we still have cultural barriers to people feeling that that's not okay. We also know that that's a place where there's a lot of violence. So if we're dealing with people at all of these points, before there's violence or apart from violence, as well as our work with Peaceful Families, which we do have a marital bliss, we have other kinds of programs that really say it's not just marriage, it's how do we throughout the lifespan work on building positive relationship skills that will serve the whole family.
Wonderful, Dr. Denise. You have such wonderful programs which seems to cover the entire gamut of what we need to do, right, to deal with this issue. And as both of you have mentioned, right, it needs everybody's involvement. Everybody needs to be a part of this movement. Yeah, and also I agree 100% with you, Amrita, when you said it's not just about ending violence, right? It's about being respectful of the other person, about understanding other person's humanity and autonomy. And we need to really start young. Like you said, right? That Peaceful Parents, I think, is what you said is so true, right? If a child has never been beaten, how is the child going to ever learn to raise their hands against somebody? That is so true. So we have to start, and we have to continue this work, and we need community help and support in all ways to tackle this problem. Thank you so much to the both of you for taking the time and spending this time with us, and with your wonderful discussion and presentations of the projects that you both of your organizations have been involved in. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And just before we end this, I would remind everybody to just take a look at the evaluation form that has been dropped in the chat, and please do fill it out because it will help us to do better, to offer you, come up with better offerings for you that will help the community understand the issues that we are facing and how together as a community we can tackle those issues. So thank you, both of you, so much. And we hope to see you again.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for all of the work that you're doing and bringing this to light to all of the communities.
Thank you.